You're up, Lee.
Hi, I want to thank everybody for coming to the fall version of the Guerrilla reading series. We are excited to be back. Excited to be back virtual. We have 3 great readers for you tonight. I'm going to just jump right into it. Our first reader for the night is Maria Giura. She is the author of What My Father Taught Me and Celibate, memoir, which won a 2020 First Place Independent Press Award. Her writing has appeared in Prime Number, Presence, Italian Americana, Lips, Terrafet, I think I pronounced that right, and Patterson Literary Review. An Academy of American Poets winner, Maria has taught writing at multiple universities, including Binghamton University, where she received her PhD in English. She currently teaches writing workshops for Casa Belvedere. Please follow her at mariagiura.com, and please welcome Maria.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much, Marco, for inviting me, and to Lee and Camelia, who are also obviously on the committee of the Guerrilla Lit reading series. What a gift to authors and audiences that you have carried on so well virtually during these last 18 months. And Patricia and John, I'm so excited about hearing you read from your work. We never met before. I'm really glad that we're matched up with one another. I'm going to read from my memoir, Celibate, as Lee mentioned. One of my very favorite quotes on the genre of autobiography and memoir comes from the novelist Graham Greene. When he was asked why he wrote his autobiography, A Sort of Life, he said that he was trying to make some order out of chaos. And when I heard that in grad school, I've never, ever forgotten it. And I think I was going for something similar, although I don't think I was aware of it the whole time I was writing my book, certainly in the beginning of the process. Chaos is a good word to describe what I got myself into, what I found myself involved with when in my late 20s and early 30s, I fell in love with a Catholic priest at the same time that I was struggling mightily with my own sense of religious calling. Some people might call the two of us a perfect storm. So I'm going to read from chapter 2. An excerpt from the beginning of the chapter and one at the end of the chapter. At this point in the narrative, I am 27 and the priest, Father James Infancy, is 31. And I don't think at this point you need to know anything else. There's plenty here. After Mass. And I can be heard well, correctly?
Perfect,
Right,
perfect.
Great, okay, good. After the concert, Father asked me if I'd light the candle on the Advent wreath at Mass. I said yes, hiding my delight. A couple of weeks later, I sent him a Christmas card with Shirley Temple standing on tippy toes in her short skirt to hang an ornament on the tree. When he thanked me for it on Sunday, he looked at me like he didn't want me to go. Then after Christmas Eve Mass, I kissed him on the cheek. The following week, he asked if I'd wait until he was done greeting parishioners so we could talk a few minutes. As he finished, he slyly popped a mint and then walked over and said hi, his fresh breath curling into the air. He was in his clerical clothing and jacket, had taken off his vestments as soon as he reached the back of the church, and I was in my long coat and a pair of heels, which I always wore so I'd look taller. The church patio had cleared out, except for a straggler or two, and the ushers had locked up the heavy maple doors. With almost a foot's difference between us, Father had his hands jammed in his pockets like he was trying to hide his excitement, and I was looking in his eyes trying to disguise mine. "You read the readings beautifully," he said, blushing. And I said, "Your homily was great as usual." Then he asked me about my job and family, and except for clearing his throat several times, he let me talk, which I loved. When we finally said goodbye, we hugged each other from the waist up as he nervously patted my back. For the next 3 months, I walked out the side door. There was always such a long line of parishioners out the front waiting to shake his hand. I was afraid of what I'd started. I also knew Father would be disappointed when he got through the line and there was no me. The fact that I could have this kind of effect on a man, on him, assuaged my unhappiness, made me feel in control, at least for a little while. A few days before Palm Sunday, Father called me to ask if I'd fill in for a lector who had canceled. He'd gotten my number from the parish files. Standing in my blue and white kitchen, I vaguely felt he'd crossed a line, but I was too excited to complain. When we spoke again after Mass, I gushed, "Father, you listen. So many people don't. They're just thinking about what they're going to say next. It's nice." Then Good Friday happened. I was with my sister Janine at the 3 o'clock service, the hour that Jesus died. The church was cloaked in purple and swelling with people, but quiet except for a sporadic cough. I was saving a seat for my friend Sylvia, who had something to tell me, but didn't want to wait until I got home from church. I tucked my hair behind my ear just in case Father Infancy was one of the celebrants. Then he and the other 2 priests were processing down the center aisle. Instead of heading for the presider's chairs as they would during Mass, they prostrated themselves on the altar. Sylvia slipped into the seat next to mine. We kissed hello, and she waved at Janine. I looked at the altar and felt an odd sense of satisfaction. Sylvia and Father Infancy in the same place. She and I had been friends since 3rd grade, except for that first semester of high school. She was always so perfect and pulled together. Her straight, dirty blonde hair never out of place. Her science scores always higher than mine. Her sins hardly worthy of confession. The night of our 8th grade awards ceremony, I'd had enough, but not because she was valedictorian. Back at her house after the ceremony, she asked me to take a picture of her and her father. My father had not been there. I'm not sure if my mother or I even bothered to ask him. When I looked through the lens, Sylvia and Mr. Pelusi, both 5'7" and holding her certificate in front of them, looked like a couple. Heads cocked, Neapolitan pride flooding their faces, especially his. I felt invisible, but I wasn't sure why, which only made it worse. A few months later, when we went off to high school, I tried to break it off with her. But when I transferred to Catholic school halfway through the year, she stopped me in the hall one day and asked, "Ree, can we be friends again?" I bowed my head, thanking God for Father, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw the emerald cut engagement ring on Sylvia's hand that she'd splayed on the pew in front of us. I'd known this day was coming. She'd been going out with Greg for a year, but I'd pretended it wasn't. She was my only single friend left. Stung, I looked at the altar, trying not to see the ring, but it pressed on me, springing up from the pew like a big, perfect bow, growing to the size of my envy. I wanted to drop my head on my sister's shoulder, but she wouldn't have understood. Even if she and the rest of my family knew that the only reason I was dating Rick, a friend of a friend who had called on Valentine's Day, was so I'd have something to do on Saturday nights, they'd never suspect I felt a calling. They'd tell me I was only 27, I'd meet the right one, there was plenty of time. I steadied myself as I looked at Father Infanzi on the floor. There was no way he was celibate because he couldn't get a wife. He had a choice, which I thought made his priesthood a beautiful sacrifice. It didn't matter that he had lifted my phone number or that whenever we spoke, he looked like he was struggling not to say something. All I saw now was a perfectly sweet, good-looking man who would have made a wonderful husband, giving his life to Christ. How did he do it? When the men rose from the floor and continued the liturgy, I was certain Father helped me overcome my jealousy. I lifted Sylvia's hand, looked directly at the gem, and mouthed as genuinely as I could, "Congratulations," and "Wow." She smiled and mouthed, "I know." After church, when Sylvia showed off her ring to me, I proudly introduced Father Infanzi to her. And so the second excerpt at the end of this chapter is 7 months later. So I'm fast forwarding. In that 7 months, he and I have gone out for 2 lunches, the first of which I initiated. And now it's Christmas Eve. On Christmas Eve, I was sitting in front of the creche after midnight mass when Father Infanzi, revved up from saying mass for the largest crowd of the year, asked me to go for coffee. I had wanted to stay in front of the manger, hoping that I'd finally get the courage to tell him about my calling, especially given the beautiful homily he just delivered. He explained that Christ not only humbled himself by coming as an infant, but also by being laid in a manger where animals ate from. It was the most precious explanation of the incarnation I'd ever heard. But then Father switched his brother's excitement when his sister-in-law gave birth. I had been sitting in the lector's seat so close to the pulpit that if I reached out my arm, I could touch Father's garment, feel his thigh beneath it. My sister Julie and brother-in-law Nick were expecting their first child in a week, the first baby in our family, which made me feel more insecure. Something inside me broke. How could God ask me to give up marriage and motherhood? Why was he taking care of every other woman but me? I promise not to keep you out too long, Father said, looking at me like an eager boy. You know what, Father? Coffee sounds nice. There was no one in the diner whom I recognized, which I was glad about. Father was wearing a long black coat that made him look so handsome, it actually hurt. He took it off, revealing his cleric shirt with only the tip of the white tab collar showing. Within minutes, we were drinking tea and exchanging the gifts we hadn't told each other we were buying. I bought him How Houses Learn, a book about how the character of houses develops over time. I didn't realize it, but I was implying that his character needed developing. When I'd hung around after morning mass the day before, he admitted that he hadn't been an ideal seminarian. He'd throw enough clothes for the weekend in a laundry bag so the rector would think he was going home, but he was headed to Atlantic City. Really? I asked, disappointed, but also a little turned on. It was something like me telling my mother I had sorority meetings on Thursday nights in college when I was really headed for the bars. Then he said, I almost didn't make it to ordination. Really? 3 priests voted me in, 3 didn't, and 1 was indecisive. I've never told this to anyone before. I never told my mother. Why? I asked. I figured once they voted me in, what was the point? How did they convince the indecisive one? One of them said to him, we have a real man here and you're going to let him get away? Father propped his elbow on the back of the pew, his hand so close to my face he could graze my cheek. Then he added, the indecisive priest later told me that he pictured me in the suburbs with a wife, kids, and picket fence. He said it as if he were fishing for me to say, I do too, as if he were suggesting we get together. He was telling me what he'd been trying to all year. He was hungry, maybe even a little angry. The split vote made complete sense. It was the same ambivalence I pretended I didn't feel. Father was going to help me answer God's call. We were going to be each other's best friend and celibate significant other. I wouldn't have to be alone anymore. I had no idea how much I was fooling myself. His hunger and anger mirrored my own. Despite the knot in my stomach, I said, I'm glad you wound up here and not the suburbs. Back in the diner, how houses lean, he asked, ripping off the last bit of wrapping paper. Learn, how houses learn, I said earnestly. You know, because you said you would have gone into contracting? Maria, this is beautiful, just beautiful, he said, lifting it over our coffee cups, trying his best to look at it and not me. How houses learn, he repeated slowly. Then he put it down and handed me a meticulously wrapped gift. And this is for you. I tore the paper, stunned to see the name of my favorite store, and then a pretty soft wool turtleneck in the perfect earthy color. Wow, how did you know my style? I like it so much. I've been looking at you for a while now. Last year you sent me a card. This year I get to sit with you. I remember it. It was a picture of Shirley Temple putting an ornament on a tray. That's it, he said, taking a gulp of tea. Did you like this year's card? I asked sheepishly. It was a picture of Raphael's cherubs. Inside I wrote, although I come across as together, I feel as if I'll always be working through past hurts. Meeting you and initiating the friendship has given me the chance to trust a man again. I treasure you in my life. Of course I did. What a blockhead I am. I loved it, he said. We were in the diner for over an hour before I asked him what time it was. That's when I noticed the Rolex. I asked him if it was new. This, just a gift from someone in the parish, he said, loosening his collar from his neck. It was an awfully showy gift for a priest to accept, one that could only be from a woman. But this was a man who knew which store to shop for me in, what fabric and color and even size I liked. No man had ever zeroed in on me so quickly. I was so swept away that I didn't realize when he changed the subject. In fact, by the time he got my coat and held the door, I'd forgotten about the watch entirely. Then, standing beside our cars, he said, "This has been my best Christmas ever." And I said, "I'm so glad." The next night, Christmas night, when he was leaving Janine's, where he'd been invited for dessert, and I was sitting on her couch wearing the turtleneck he gave me, I looked in his eyes with such longing that I knew it would excite him. Several weeks later, he told me that all he'd wanted to do at that moment was hug the life out of me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was great. Maria's book is available in the chat section. We're listing all the books through Bookshop. So please order her book if you like the reading. We're going to move on right to our next reader. Our next reader is Patricia Park. She's the author of Jane, a modern day retelling of Bronte's Jane Eyre, and the forthcoming novel Imposter Syndrome and Other Confessions of Alejandra Kim. A former Fulbright scholar, Edith Wharton Writer-in-Residence, and Jerome Hill Artist Fellow. She's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, Guardian, and others. She's a professor of creating writing in American University's MFA program. Please give a warm welcome to Patricia.
Hi all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being here. Maria, thank you for sharing such a beautiful story. So I wrote a novel called Jane that I'll be reading from tonight. It is a modern day retelling of Jane Eyre, which I suppose is kind of audacious to take such a revered classic, right? And not only that, but set it in the world of queens, of Korean American blue collar queens. I'm curious if any of you are fellow Jane Eyre heads. If you are, either wave a hand, holla, what's up, or drop a hi in the chat. Oh, awesome. I'm seeing so much love, so much of my people. Also, the rest of you are my people as well. So, you know, it's cool. but for me, you know, and I think we all have our own kind of special connection to this work, but for me, what really drew me in is that Jane Eyre, Bronte's Jane Eyre, self-identified as poor, obscure, plain, and little. And for any of us who've ever felt like the underdog, like someone who was either dealt a bad hand in life or just was on the outside looking in, I think a work like Jane Eyre and a character like Jane is one that really touches and speaks to that feeling of loneliness. So I created my version of Jane Eyre. Her name is Jane Rhee, and she's a mixed race Korean-American orphan. We will learn that her family upbringing was somewhat scandalous, and she's kind of living with that legacy as a mixed race person. She kind of wears basically her mother's shame manifest in her face. And for me also, I'm really curious about Queens as a literary landscape. I'm born and raised in Queens. Lee, I know you're hailing from Queens at the moment.
I'm in Queens at the moment, yes.
You are repping.
Always.
And, you know, in so much of New York set, not, you know, literature, books, we think of The Great Gatsby as the great American novel. Queens is just a literal bypass, right? You have the TJ or JT Ecclesburg sign, and you've got Wilson's gas station. And my borough's literary legacy is what Fitzgerald calls, quote, the Valley of Ashes. Can we just sit with that for a moment? The Valley of Ashes. All of Gatsby's characters, you know, jet set from these sprawling mansions of Long Island to these like fabulously boozy parties in the city. And so much of the literary landscape, you know, Brooks come on the scene as well, but you don't really have novels of the story of communities that are a literal stop, right? You're just zooming on through. So for me, I wanted to explore that with Jane, and to write maybe oxymoronically or moronically enough, the great Queen's Korean American novel. So I'll read a little bit from the work, mostly from the beginning, so you'll be grounded. Home was this northeastern knot of Queens in the town, if you could even call it a town, of Flushing. Northern Boulevard was our main commercial thoroughfare, and family-attached houses crowded its side streets. They say the neighborhood once contained a hearty swath of the American population. But when I landed here as an infant, Flushing was starting to give way to the Koreans. By the time I graduated from college in 2000, Northern looked like this: Taedong River Fish Market, named after the East River of Pyongyang. Joseon Dynasty Auto Body, run by the father of a girl from my BC Calc class. Kumgang Mountain Dry Cleaning, owned by my uncle's accountant's cousin on his mother's side. This was my America, all Korean, all the time. Flushing. The irony was that none of its residents could pronounce the name of their adopted hometown. The Korean language lacked certain English consonants and clusters. The letter F was assimilated to an H or a P. The adults at church will go whoo as they formed the word, as if cooling it off their tongue. My uncle and aunt's rendition, poo, rushing. It could have been poetry. Home was 718 Gates Street, Unit 1. It was my Uncle Sang's house, and I lived there with his family, his wife, Hannah, and my younger cousins, Mary and George. A few blocks away was his store. It was a modest-sized grocery carrying a mix of American and Korean products, along with the usual emergency supplies, flashlights and batteries, candles, condoms. From Northern, you could spot our green awning bearing 4 white letters in all caps, FOOD. So this is the world that Jane comes from. And she is, as we'll begin to read, or as we'll start to learn, dying to get out of Flushing. One day in late summer, I was crouched in one of the aisles, turning cans of bean face out and flush with the lip of the shelf. I heard someone saying Korean, Jane, I learned about Lowood. What a shame. It was Mrs. Bae, the wife of the pastor of our church. I stood and ducked my head into a bow. At 5'7", I towered over the women of Flushing. Her words were like salt sprinkled on the sting of being the only one in my graduate class still bagging groceries. The economy was, for the most part, still booming. I'd had a job with low capital partners lined up, never anticipating that the company would be heavily leveraged in dot-com investments. The CEO would resign after accusations of insider trading, and the interim CEO would issue a hiring freeze. My job offer had been rescinded. Mrs. Bay went on about how her daughter Jessica worked such long hours at Bear Stearns, yet would still wash the rice and do the laundry and help her little sister with her homework. How Mrs. Bay felt really undeserving of such a devoted daughter. What Mrs. Bay didn't know was that Jessica, the PK, pastor's kid, had cut class every Thursday our senior year of high school to shoot pool at Amsterdam Billiards in the city. I'll tell her, Jessica, to help you find a job, Mrs. Beth said, staring back with the usual curious expression she seemed to reserve for me. You'd think after all these years I would have gotten used to it. I didn't. I averted my eyes, focusing on the hairline cracks running through the floor tiles. No, that's too much trouble for you. That was my uncle saying, rushing towards us. They had the usual exchange. No trouble at all. What can you do? You must be so worried. Before my uncle turned his head sharply, shooting me a look. I thanked Mrs. Bay. Then he shot me another look. That was my cue to get her some fruit on the house, and none of the cheap stuff. That was the power of nunchi. There's no word for it in English. Perhaps its closest literal translation is I sense. My friend Eunice O sometimes likened nunchi to the eye of Sarin, an all-knowing stink eye that monitored your every social misstep. I don't know if there are any LOTR fans out there. Other times she said it was like the Force, a way of bending the world to your will. But Eunice had an annoying tendency of bringing everything back to Star Wars or Star Trek, Tolkien or Philip K. Dick. For me, nunchi was less about some sci-fi power and more about common sense. It was the ability to read a situation and anticipate how you were expected to behave. The adults at church always said that good nunchi was the result of a good family education. So her day goes on in the grocery, and Jane finally then answers an ad to become an au pair. There's an ad in the Village Voice, which I'll read aloud. Brooklyn family desiring au pair. We wish to invite into our family an au pair, i.e. a live-in babysitter, although, nota bene, we take issue with such infantilizing labels. Seeing as the term has yet to be eradicated from the vernacular, we have opted, albeit reluctantly, to use it in this text for the sole purpose of engaging in the lingua franca, who will foster a nurturing, intellectually stimulating, culturally sensitive, and ultimately loving environment. We will indulge the most essentialist Platonic construct of the term, loving, for our 9-year-old daughter, adopted from the Liaoning province of China. In these postmodern, post-racial times, we desire said au pair to challenge the existing hegemonic ... The ad cuts out, exceeding the allotted space. And in this last short scene I'll read for you, Jane is leaving Queens on the 7 train for Brooklyn, where she is answering that very ad and the very people that decided to write that ad for this au pair job. She's just really longing to get out of Queens. And the whole novel really is a journey of home, identity, but also home. The novel begins and ends with the word home. So Jane is grasping about trying to find her home. I boarded the 7 train leaving Main Street Station. There was an unmistakable rattle whenever you stepped aboard the 7, as if the train cars were hinged together by a single loose pin. But I wasn't heading for the city. I was on my way to Brooklyn. There was a geographical irony of leaving Queens for Brooklyn, 2 outer boroughs that abutted each other. The fastest route was not to travel along the more efficient hypotenuse, but to make a right angle through Manhattan, crossing both bridge and tunnel. It's not that we had beef per se. We acknowledged our kindred scrappiness to the city. We were, after all, bridge and tunnel. All our roads led to Manhattan. It was the borough that blazed in its own violet light and threw scraps of shadows on the rest of us. I'd driven through Brooklyn only a handful of times in my life. My Uncle Sang would make us roll up the windows and double check that the car doors were locked. He'd written off the entire borough after a fruit and vegetable he owned on Smith Street went up in flames during a blackout. According to my Aunt Hannah, Sang had stumbled home that night with burnt clothes, a black eye, and a busted rib. Since then, his mind conflated the three Bs: Brooklyn, Black people, and the blackout. Add to that one more B, a baby, a bundle of joy. Me. I was a burden, the daughter of his dead younger sister, and a mixed blood bastard to boot. My mother had done a stupid thing as a college student up in Seoul. She fell in love. It was an indulgence at a time when most marriages were arranged. Worse, she fell for an American man, a GI, or so the story went. My grandfather kicked my pregnant mother out, or maybe she left on her own accord. Sang was stingy with the details. All he ever offered up about my mother's life was contained in 3 terse sentences. Long time ago, your mother used to listening your grandpa. Then one day she stopped. Now she did. Aunt Hannah filled in the patches of the narrative of the sister-in-law she had never met. Your mother was a wild fox girl. Don't you dare grow up to become like her. In any case, my mother had me, a honhyol, a mixed blood. Then she died of carbon monoxide poisoning from the fumes of cheap coal briquettes, an all too common occurrence in Korea back then. Rightfully, I should have died too, had not Providence, or maybe it was the police, saved me from the wreckage. After her death, the responsibility of dealing with me defaulted to my grandfather. The way I pictured it, he stepped outside one morning to get a drink from the well, and there I was, swaddled on his doorstep. He stared down at me and thought, oh shit. There was no question I would have been stigmatized if I'd stayed in the motherland, where my dubious lineage would have undoubtedly come to light. But here's another geographical irony for you. I traveled nearly 7,000 miles across the globe to escape societal censure, only to end up in the second largest Korean community in the Western world. We were stuttering our way out of Queens. The 7 train was like that, torridic. The lights blinked on and off, the rickety train cars jerking from side to side, as much as front and back. I stared at the other slumped passengers, the faces repeating in a pattern: Korean, Hispanic, Chinese, Chinese again, Indian. You could always tell by their worn expressions that they were going from home to work. You could tell by their worn shoes, all sharing the same thick rubber soles, designed to absorb the work of the day. The train emerged above ground, the windows opening to the sprawl of Flushing. First, you saw a beautiful clock tower set on top of a concrete storage warehouse with loud capital letters, U-Haul. Then the Van Wyck snaking its way through heaps of sand and ash, through auto body shops and junkyard lots. There were rows of brown frayed tarp storefronts with Korean lettering. Then the view of Shea, a stadium the shade of working class blue. On game nights, you could barely make out the half-hearted roars of the half-empty crowds. Ahead, the silvered peaks of the Midtown skyline glinted in that violet light. This was our Queens wasteland. Then the lights in the train car flickered off, as they often do on the 7 train. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was awesome. I'm in Queens now, but I felt Queens even more reading it, and I'll likely probably take the 7 train home as well. We'll see. Yeah. So Patricia's book is available. Please purchase it through the chat if you're interested on bookshop.org. And we'll move on to our last reader. Our last reader for the night is John Domini. He published his 10th book, a memoir, The Archaeology of a Good Ragu, earlier in 2021. Before then appeared 4 novels, the most recent, The Color Inside a Melon, 2019. His work has been praised in Washington Post and elsewhere, and he has 3 books of stories, the latest Moviola, ! John has won awards in all genres and appeared in Paris Review and the New York Times. Grants include an NEA Fellowship and an Iowa Major Artist Award. He's taught at Harvard, Northwestern, and elsewhere, and makes his home in Des Moines with the science fiction writer Lettie Prell. Please give a warm welcome to John.
Thank you. Thanks very much. First question, I heard everybody fine, no problem. How about you? Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you perfect.
Coming through, okay. And you see this is the memoir you just spoke about. Yeah, it's the archaeology of a good ragu. It considers me and Naples. This artwork, which comes from Naples, expresses the essential paradox of Naples, the volcano over the sea. It's an ancient seaport, complicated place, and it's where my father was born, Vincenzo Vice Domini. He shortened it to Domini when he came here as an adult following World War II. He came to New York, in fact, as an adult following World War II. And a lot of his experience over in Naples remained hidden to his kids. He's a wonderful father. I'm a lucky man in my father. But I reached my own adulthood not knowing a good deal about his the town he grew up in, the city he grew up in. And though I visited, it was only in my midlife when I suffered classic breakdowns, professional and personal, that I began really reconnecting to Naples. Essentially, this is a memoir of a return from a midlife crisis, but instead of going hiking on the Pacific Coast Trail, I kept going to Naples again and again. And I uncovered some of my father's, a lot of my father's secrets. And I'm going to read a section here that has to do with the month we're in, September. September of 1943 and a more recent September, you'll remember. No Broadway, please. More recent September. My father told a very few stories about his experience out of the war. A guerrilla fighter, as it turned out, a partisan fighting the Nazis around Naples. And one of the very few stories he told had to do with a night he and his brother, on the run from the Nazis, hid out in a convent out in the hills. He and Gigi, his brothers, noticed their accent, and it turns out the order of this convent was based in Vienna. It's an odd detail for him to bring it up. What difference did it make? But my father always insisted on this part of the story. The nuns came from Austria, and only a skeleton crew, a stubborn half dozen, remained. Now, overall, the episode is one of those few small glimmers of humanity that shines through every war. And it must have owed a lot, I'd say now, to my father's church training, his Italian equivalent of college prep. Beyond that, or through that, the sisters must have sensed his receptivity to the divine spirit, which was so resonant in we Vice Dominis. We'd spent generations with this name, second to the Lord, Vice Domini. And the story, as he told it, is certainly full of the spirit of the gospel. The boys, the two brothers, got their soup and bread. They got a bath, and they recited the Hail Mary and Our Father. Now, the comfort they took, certainly that was real, a relief such as my life never knew. But I did experience a cross-generational synchronicity. I did learn of the 9/11 attacks in a Naples convent. Some of my family, I think, would have seen God's hand in that moment. September again. One of my sisters, one of the sisters pulled me into her office. On a pint-sized black and white, the antenna began to suggest the Twin Towers. Then they look likewise easy to snap, those towers. The devastation unfolded before us, gathering in the small room, 8 of us, often the only sound, with the TV on mute during work hours, was a woman praying the rosary. Now, this was in Santa Chiara, still staffed by the members of that order, the Order of Clarice, though it's no longer actually a convent. The church stands in the center of town, right along Spacca Napoli, a landmark in its way as prominent as the towers. Out back, you might almost be in the countryside. There's a garden cloister bordered by cooling galleries. It startles a newcomer with how it subdues the roar and hustle of downtown. All at once, you're in the peaceable kingdom, the greenery, almost bonsai, the Maiolica tile everywhere, and painted with bucolic 18th century scenes. I never tire of playing the impromptu tour guide. And on that afternoon in 2001, I was speaking American English with some visitor. The nun who took my arm may have even heard me say New York. After that, we spent, I don't know, almost an hour with the news. When at last I needed to back away, I did manage to thank the Chiara sister, but only the power of her look, commiserating, penetrating, brought me out of my shock enough to notice she was dark, perhaps Egyptian, perhaps Syrian. She might have been a refugee. And my friends in Lower Manhattan, friends and relatives, and for that matter, the whole city, where would they flee to? I wound up in the church sanctuary in a pew. Between wordless prayers, I'd lift my eyes to the 14th century vaults, naked and gray. At one time, the church's tall interior had been a showcase, smothered with painted Maiolica. There too, the ornamentation, however, couldn't survive summer 43. Then a blockbuster hit, left fires burning out of control for days. Many died, including clergy. Myself, in 01, I remained lucky or blessed. I lost no one to bin Laden's attacks. Still, that afternoon, in a Naples church, in shocked communion with other older killing rains, it takes me to the rest of my father's story. The nuns that gave him sanctuary might have been Austrian, but they weren't singing. They knew about the Nazi roundups, the reprisals, and they must have had visitors before these two. They were smart enough to consider the neighbors. The only way to be safe was to make these boys disappear. And if that sounds like a horror story, what these women came up with was worthy of Poe. Beneath the altar lay the crypt for their former colleagues. Now, when Pop told this story, he never left this out, the way the sisters had prepared his and Gigi's beds. They cleared what was in there, he would say, and then they put us in. The accommodations alone made sleeping difficult. But then came the night's foot traffic. The Germans arrived, a squad, more soldiers perhaps than nuns. Their search didn't stop at sundown. In the city, the fight had gotten serious. My father never forgot the heavy tread above, never left out those boot steps. He believed he heard the officer in charge. Holy ground, he would say. This made the commandant nervous. Now, just to reveal this much, the man had done some heavy lifting. And at that point, always, the story ended. The Tedeschi withdrew, their tread receding. The sisters redoubled their prayers. Nobody got much sleep. And come morning, the only choice for Enzo and Gigi was to head back out. Their benefactors had chores, harvest season, and the brothers ran off, disappearing into the same story that I heard for half a century. The whole truth would never have emerged, really, if Enzo's son hadn't become himself such a shook-up father. My lurching between old world and new appears to have jarred the lid off, hit the long ago hardships of my father. Every year, after all, my Italian grew better and my questions more pointed. Besides, not long after I began to dig in his past, Pop suffered his first heart attack. Few things will prompt confessions like a visit from the Reaper. And soon enough, there came another evening, my first visit after he'd gotten out of the hospital. He'd been spending a lot of time with the television, RAI Internazionale, the soccer especially, but I found him with the set off. It shook me just to look at him, the cushions molded to his shrunken frame, calling to mind a shroud. The head of hair I've inherited, the lush moil we owe to some African or Arab in the bloodline. This lay in limp shreds. Then his eyes rose. He asked if I remembered his story about staying with the nuns. At least I kept my response serious. It must have been a terrible night, Pop. But the worst, he said, came the next night. After dark, returning to the Orchard Convent must have seemed harmless. The country above Naples was quiet at this turning point in Pop's war. But the older brother found the church door ajar. And in there, he went on, the worst. All over the local heights, folks could use a favor. There was always something to be arranged, exchanging information. And as for the commandant, the night before, he'd shown a certain weakness. Now, he left all 6 of the sisters strung up in the rafters. 2 Septembers, worlds apart. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. I want to thank all of our readers. All of our readers' books are available for sale on Bookshop as well. What we've done at the end of this of the series usually is we open it up to the audience if they have any questions for the authors. You could either type it in the chat or, I don't know, raise your hand and I'll answer it. And yeah, we've just done that for like a couple minutes after, if anybody has any pressing questions. See,
I should say I come out of the experience all right.
good to hear. Definitely
The well-balanced individual you see before you.
Okay, so it doesn't seem like there's questions. Yeah, here we go. For all authors, here we go. Thank you, Kirsten. For all authors, what was the moment you decided to write your story?
Oh.
Go ahead, John.
I'm sort of warm, but I don't have to go. I'm warm, you know.
Okay,
it's in my head.
Go for it.
Really, you guys, Maria, Patricia, that all right?
You can go first,
for it.
John,
Yeah.
since it's like you feel like it's very palpable. You can go first.
Yeah, I'm warm. I'm warmed up.
Yeah, sure.
I actually, in my case, this is a terrifying question because I kept going to Naples and going to Naples, and I knew I was some kind of writer at least, and I published journalism about Naples, somewhat more complex things about Naples, and I had all this Naples material in notebooks. I just kept filling up notebooks, but I honestly, it was years. It was a good 20 years of stories until, like a creature in some fable, I discovered that my Naples book was my story. You know, isn't there the fable of the 30 birds who fly and then realize the third to paradise, but paradise is 30 birds flying? I didn't get to paradise, but I realized that the story was my own, that I had to tell this midlife recovery story. And that was the way to talk about Naples, what it meant, and perhaps put old ghosts to rest. So it was very long in the process. Once I got that, I had a 3-part structure, and, you know, it happened a little more quickly after that. How's that?
Good. What about you, Patricia or Maria?
Maria, would you like to, is it hot, palpable for you? Would you?
Sure,
like to
sure.
go?
This will probably sound strange, but I think even while I was in the midst of the relationship with the priest, there was a sense that I had to write about it, that I would write about it one day, even as I was living it. But when I got serious about writing it, it coincided with going to Binghamton University in Binghamton, upstate New York, for my PhD. They had and have still a dual track where your PhD could be a traditional one or it could be a creative one. And I knew that that if I did want to write a book, I would need the discipline of this assignment and a dissertation. And so when I got there, that's what I started working on. With that said, it still wasn't done years after I defended it as a dissertation. I mean, it was finished, but it wasn't publishable. And I still had to do a lot of, I needed more chronological distance from an emotional distance from the experience to actually write about it with some detachment that I think, you know, all writers need from it. You know, I think writers need from an experience before they can write about it better than when they're in the midst of it. So that's when I got serious about writing it. But it was a long process. It took me over 10 years to finish.
Wow.
Because I was afraid, because I didn't know the full truth. I was finding out the truth as I wrote it. I don't even know how many drafts I had. It's not even worth trying to count. So I hope that answers the question somehow.
Definitely.
For me, Jane, when I was younger, my mother, when I would misbehave, my mother would say in her limited English, "You act like orphan." And I never knew what that meant, to act like an orphan. But because she's my biological mother, I'm not an orphan, but I realized that for her and her generation of war-torn Koreans, that to act like an orphan was to behave in a way that as if you were parentless, a way that you were shaming your parents with your actions. And I kind of suppressed that moment until in grad school, I was reading a lot of academic scholarship on Victorian literature and the role of the orphan in Jane Eyre, in the Dickensian canon, and how the Victorians understood orphans as to somehow to be inherently wicked, mischievous, of unknown identity, and to be this kind of mercurial, questionable quality. So my mind kind of drew a link between these two constructs of the orphan, and I think Jane was born from that. Thank you for the question.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to all the authors for sharing their stories. Does anybody have any more questions? Any last pressing Q&A that they want to ask? Okay, if not, I think we'll call it a night. I want to thank our three wonderful readers, Patricia, Marie, and John, for sharing their time with us. We will be back on October 27th for our last reading of the year with three more great readers. So please check us out then. We'll be going virtual again. And a big thanks to Dixon Place as well for always having us and supporting us. And hopefully we will be back there in the spring. And again, thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye-bye. Stay
Have a
in
good night,
touch,
everyone.
everybody.
Take
Stay
care.
in
Good to
touch.
meet you.
Bye.
Good to meet you, John. Good to meet you,
Yeah.
Patricia.
Nice
Good to
meeting you
meet
both.
you.
Thank you for the
Wonderful work,
opportunity.
both of
Thank
you.
you.
Of
Wonderful
course. Yeah,
work.
no, I'm gonna pick up all your books. They all seem awesome. Thank